The elders used to say that the Blackwater River had moods, just like men. On some mornings it moved clear and patient, reflecting the sky with deceptive calm. On others, it darkened without warning, thick as ink, carrying branches, bones, and memories no one had placed there. Long before the village existed, before the road was carved and the church bell ever rang, the river had already learned the names of those who would one day fear it. The forest around it had grown not outward, but inward, folding over itself in layers of shadow, roots gripping the soil like hands that refused to let go. Elijah Crow began to understand that the Caboclo d'Agua was not a presence that arrived suddenly. It had always been there. What changed was not the spirit, but the people. As the days passed after the first flood, Elijah noticed how the forest behaved when men approached it with hesitation instead of confidence. Branches creaked even when there was no wind. The sound of water seemed to follow footsteps along certain paths, and sometimes, when Elijah stood still long enough, he could feel the ground beneath his boots vibrating faintly like a slow heartbeat traveling through roots and stone. More stories surfaced, dragged from throats that had stayed silent for years. A trapper told of his brother who vanished while setting snares near Deadman Creek, leaving behind a knife driven upright into the riverbank, blade rusted overnight as if decades had passed in a single evening. A woman spoke of her husband, found alive but changed, staring at the river for hours after being pulled from its depths, whispering apologies to something no one else could see. These weren't tales meant to scare children. They were confessions, spoken softly, as if the forest itself might overhear and take offense at exaggeration. Elijah started keeping a ledger of his own, not of supplies or debts, but of patterns. He noted the nights when fog rolled in before dusk, the mornings when birds avoided the river entirely, the days when the waterline crept inches higher without cause. He marked where Boone Ricker had vanished, where footprints first appeared, where the forest seemed to thin just enough to reveal movement behind it. What emerged was not chaos, but intention. The Caboclo d'Agua did not strike at random. It responded. Every disappearance followed an act of intrusion. Trees felled too deep, streams diverted, traps set where offerings had once been left. At night, Elijah's dreams grew heavier. He no longer dreamed as a man watching events unfold, but as someone standing inside them. He dreamed of walking the riverbed while water flowed above his head, hearing voices distorted by distance and depth. He dreamed of hands made of root and silt, reaching for him, not to drag him under, but to hold him still. In these dreams, the Caboclo d'Agua never spoke in words. Meaning arrived all at once, flooding the mind the way water floods low ground, inescapable, undeniable. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Elijah noticed something new. The fog did not roll in evenly. It gathered in columns near the river, standing upright, like pale figures waiting to be counted. As he watched, one column drifted away from the water, sliding slowly toward the forest path Boone had taken on his last morning. The air around it smelled of wet leaves and old wood. Elijah felt the now familiar chill spread across his skin. This was not a warning. It was an invitation. Against the advice of every fearful voice in the village, Elijah followed the fog into the trees. Each step took him farther from the road and closer to the deep forest, where sound died and light thinned. The ground grew soft underfoot, soaked not with recent rain, but with something older, something that never fully dried. The fog thickened, curling around trunks, rising to shoulder height, blurring distance until the world felt reduced to breath and heartbeat. Somewhere ahead, water dripped in a steady rhythm, though no stream should have been there. Elijah stopped when the forest opened into a clearing he did not remember, though he was certain it had always existed. At its center stood a massive tree, its roots exposed like ribs breaking through the earth, its bark dark and slick as if constantly damp. The air around it vibrated faintly. This was a place of waiting, of remembering. Elijah understood. with a clarity that frightened him more than any apparition, that this was not where the caboclo d'agua hunted. This was where it judged. The shape that emerged from the shadow of the great tree did not step forward all at once. It seemed to assemble itself from the forest, fog thickening into limbs, darkness knitting into a torso, water sliding along a form that could not decide whether it was flesh or something older. Elijah's breath caught, not because the sight was violent, but because it felt inevitable, like watching a river crest a bank that had already been weakened by time. The caboclo d'agua stood taller than any man Elijah had known, its posture straight yet fluid, as if gravity had agreed to treat it differently. Its skin bore the texture of soaked bark and river stone, streaked with lines that looked like veins, until Elijah realized they were currents, slow and deliberate, moving beneath the surface. The eyes were the worst part, not because they were monstrous, but because they were patient. They glowed faintly green, not like fire, but like deep water catching moonlight. They did not fix on Elijah with hunger or rage. They weighed him, measured him. Elijah felt that weight press into his chest, into memories he had not thought of in years. The first tree he had helped fell, the way the stump had bled sap, the creek he had helped divert to make room for wagons, the laughter he had shared when older men dismissed warnings as nonsense. None of these memories arrived as accusations. They arrived as facts, laid out calmly, as if the forest were reading back a ledger he had forgotten he was keeping. The caboclo d'agua moved closer without sound. Where it stepped, the ground darkened, moisture seeping up as though the earth itself recognized its authority. Elijah's legs trembled, but he did not run. He understood now that flight would mean nothing. The forest did not chase, it closed. The spirit stopped a few paces from him, and in that stillness, Elijah felt the forest breathe around them, leaves rustling in unison, roots tightening, insects falling silent. The world narrowed to that clearing, that tree, that presence. When the caboclo finally spoke, the voice did not come from its mouth. It rose from everywhere at once, the drip of water from roots, the sigh of fog through branches, the low movement of the river far beyond the trees. It was not a sound meant for ears alone. It settled directly into Elijah's thoughts, heavy and slow, like water filling a hollow. There were no words at first, only understanding. The father of the forest did not demand worship. It demanded memory. It demanded recognition of limits crossed and balances broken. Men had not listened because the forest had spoken too quietly. Now it spoke as loudly as it knew how. Images pressed into Elijah's mind. He saw the river as it had been before cabins lined its banks, clear and wide, fish flashing beneath the surface like living coins. He saw offerings placed carefully at the water's edge, hands withdrawing with respect. Then the images shifted, trees falling, streams choked with debris, iron biting into soil without pause. Bunrika appeared in the vision, not screaming, not struggling, but staring upward through dark water, eyes wide with sudden understanding as the river closed over him. The caboclo did not show this to frighten Elijah. It showed it because truth required witnesses. Elijah dropped to his knees. The cold seeped through his trousers, through skin, into bone. He felt small, not in shame, but in scale. "Tell me what to do," he whispered, unsure if his voice existed outside his own head. The forest answered not with instruction, but with consequence. If the balance was restored, the river would recede, the whispers would fade. If not, Blackwater would be taken piece by piece, quietly, until no one remained to remember it had ever been there. The father did not threaten. It explained. When Elijah stumbled back into the village near dawn, his face drawn and eyes shadowed, people knew something had shifted. The fog lifted higher than usual, revealing the river line in full. Elijah spoke little at first. He gathered those who would listen. Not everyone did, and told them what he had seen, not as a story, but as a reckoning. Some laughed nervously, others crossed themselves, but enough believed. Enough had seen footprints where no man walked, heard names carried on water, felt the ground move beneath their feet. The work that followed was slow and deliberate. It was not destruction, but undoing. The mill upriver was dismantled plank by plank. Its stones returned to the bank. Channels dug to redirect water were filled back in. Traps were pulled from places where offerings once rested. At the river's edge, they placed tobacco, bread, and silence, not as payment but as acknowledgement. As they worked, the forest watched. Branches creaked. Birds circled and then returned. The river's surface smoothed, reflecting the sky with less distortion. Still, the caboclo d'agua did not vanish. Elijah sensed it often, standing just beyond sight, present but no longer pressing. The whispers softened, no longer naming, no longer accusing. At night, the fog thinned instead of thickened. Dogs ventured farther along the trails. Horses drank without shying away. Life resumed, but it did so cautiously, as if everyone understood they were guests now, not owners. Years passed. Blackwater Village did not grow. It endured. Travelers came and left with stories they struggled to explain. Some claimed to see a tall figure standing where river met forest on fog-laden nights, watching without malice. Others swore they heard water speak, not in words, but in warnings felt rather than heard. When maps were redrawn, Blackwater was marked smaller. Then, not at all. Cabins rotted back into soil. The church bell rusted silent. The road disappeared beneath roots that reclaimed their space patiently. As the years wore on, Elijah Crow became something of a fixture in the stories told by travelers who passed through the edge of the forest. He aged quietly, his hair silvering, his movements slowing, but his eyes never lost the careful attention of a man who had learned how thin the line was between survival and erasure. He no longer ran his supply shack for profit. He kept it open out of habit and perhaps duty, offering food and warmth to those who needed it, and warnings to those who did not wish to listen. Some laughed at him. Most did not. Elijah noticed that the forest had mood still, but they were no longer sudden or violent. Instead, they felt measured. When men approached with greed, the woods grew dense, paths twisting subtly until they led nowhere. When they came with respect, the forest opened just enough to allow passage. The river, too, seemed to choose who it carried safely and who it turned away. A man could cross it 12 times without incident, only to be pulled under on the 13th if he forgot himself. The father of the forest did not punish mistakes. It punished insistence. Sometimes Elijah would sit at dusk by the riverbank, listening. Not for voices, those had long since faded, but for rhythm, the slow lap of water against stone, the distant creak of trees settling, the sound of insects returning in careful numbers. He had learned that silence was not absence, it was presence at rest, and on certain nights, when fog drifted low and the moon hung pale and distant, Elijah could feel the caboclo d'agua nearby, not watching him, but sharing the same space. As two old sentinels might share a long road without speaking, travelers continued to bring their own stories. A hunter claimed his compass spun uselessly whenever he strayed too close to the river after sundown. A preacher swore his prayers echoed differently near the water, as if something listened without judgment. A child once said she saw a tall man made of mist standing knee-deep in the river, humming a tune that made the fish gather and the frogs fall silent. Elijah never confirmed these tales. He never denied them either. He understood now that belief was less important than behavior. There were, of course, those who tested the boundary, men who arrived with new tools and old arrogance, convinced that stories were only stories. One such group tried to reopen the mill years after it had been dismantled, hauling iron and lumber upriver with loud confidence. The river rose that night without rain. Equipment vanished. Wagons sank into mud that hardened like stone around them. No one died. No one needed to. The message was sufficient. They left at dawn, pale and quiet, carrying nothing but memory. As Blackwater faded from use and from maps, the forest reclaimed what had been borrowed. Roofs collapsed inward, feeding moss and vines. Walls softened into soil. The road dissolved beneath roots that had waited patiently for decades. Only the river remained unchanged in its course, though it ran clearer than it once had, reflecting trees instead of debris. Animals returned fully. Deer, birds, even the shy ones that avoided human presence. Life resumed not because the forest forgave, but because balance had been restored. Elijah knew his time was nearing its end when the dreams returned, not with fear, but with familiarity. He dreamed again of standing in the river, but this time the water did not rise above his knees. The caboclo d'agua stood beside him, not towering, but level, its form softer, less defined. There were no visions of judgment now, only remembrance. The Father did not speak. It did not need to. Elijah understood that his role had never been to defeat or appease the Spirit. It had been to listen, to carry memory forward until it could stand on its own. On his final walk to the river, Elijah moved slowly, leaning on a stick polished smooth by years of use. The fog parted gently as he approached the bank, and the water stilled. He sat and rested, letting the cold seep into him without resistance. For a long while, he listened to the forest breathe. When he finally closed his eyes, there was no fear, no sudden pull. The river did not take him. The forest did not close around him. He simply became quiet, like the land itself at rest. Long after Elijah Crow was gone, long after the last cabin fell and the last path vanished, people still spoke of the place where the forest met the dark river. They spoke carefully, with lowered voices, not out of terror but respect. They said the caboclo d'agua still stood watch there, unchanged, unhurried, ensuring that the old truth was never entirely forgotten. There were seasons, after Elijah Crow was gone, when the forest seemed almost gentle. Spring brought mist that smelled of new growth, and the river reflected the sky in soft blues instead of black. Travelers who passed near Blackwater during those times sometimes questioned the old warnings. They would stop, listen, and hear nothing but water and wind. It was easy, in such moments, to believe the stories had been exaggerated by fear and time. That belief never lasted long. The forest was patient. It allowed doubt the way stone allows moss, briefly, and only on the surface. One autumn, a surveyor rode close to the old crossing, carrying papers that spoke of renewed interest in the land. He camped near the river, confident in measurements and numbers. That night, he heard footsteps circling his fire, slow and deliberate, each step followed by the sound of water dripping onto leaves. He claimed later that a voice spoke from the darkness, not threatening, not loud, but firm, reminding him that lines drawn on paper meant nothing to roots that had been growing for centuries. At dawn, his maps were gone, soaked through and unreadable, pressed flat beneath a stone at the river's edge. He left without taking another measurement. Children born in settlements miles away sometimes dreamed of a tall figure standing in water, watching them with eyes that glowed softly, not with menace, but with recognition. Parents dismissed these dreams as coincidence, until more than one child described the same details: the smell of wet bark, the sound of water moving where there was none, the feeling of being seen rather than threatened. Elders who heard these accounts nodded quietly. They knew memory had a way of traveling without roads. The forest itself seemed to guide those who entered it with the right intent. Hunters who took only what they needed found their paths straightened, game appearing without struggle. Those who pushed deeper out of greed found the woods folding in on itself, landmarks shifting, distances stretching, compasses spinning uselessly. Some wandered for days before emerging, shaken but alive, carrying with them the unshakable sense that something had chosen not to finish what it had started. On certain nights, when the moon hid behind clouds and the fog lay thick as wool, the river would rise just enough to cover the stones at the crossing. People passing nearby swore they saw figures standing knee-deep in the water, motionless, facing the forest as if listening to instructions only they could hear. No one approached those figures. No one needed to. By morning, the water would recede, leaving the ground damp and cold, marked by no footprints at all. Stories accumulated slowly, layering over one another like rings inside a tree. A man who tried to dam a tributary found his tools rusted solid overnight. A woman who washed clothes too deep into the current heard her own voice calling from upstream, though she never spoke. A group of boys who mocked the old warning spent one long night lost within sight of their own lantern light, unable to reach it no matter how they walked. Each story ended the same way: survival followed by silence. The caboclo d'agua never needed to appear fully again. Its presence was woven into the behavior of the land itself. The forest no longer screamed its warnings, it whispered them. The river no longer dragged men under without reason. It waited, allowing choice to reveal intention. Balance had been restored, not through fear alone, but through understanding hard-earned and carefully maintained. As decades passed, the name Blackwater faded entirely. New roads curved wide around the forest. New settlements rose elsewhere, on land that welcomed the weight of buildings and rails. Yet the old river remained where it had always been, dark and slow beneath overhanging trees. Those who stumbled upon it by accident felt an immediate urge to lower their voices, to move carefully, to acknowledge something they could not see but knew was present. In time, the caboclo d'agua became less a figure and more a principle, a reminder carried in stories told by firelight, in warnings whispered to children before sleep. Not a monster lurking in the dark, but a guardian of memory, ensuring that what had been learned was not easily forgotten. The forest endured because it was allowed to endure. The river flowed because it was permitted to flow. And on rare nights, when fog draped the water and the world felt thin, those standing quietly at the river's edge claimed they sensed a tall presence beside them, not looming, not demanding, simply there, watching the balance hold, waiting for the next moment when memory would need to be reminded of itself. There came a time when the forest around the old Blackwater crossing seemed to teach without words. Travelers who wandered too close found themselves slowing their pace without knowing why, their breathing matching the steady cadence of water moving beneath roots. Even those unfamiliar with the old stories sensed a presence that demanded awareness. It was not fear that settled into them, but attentiveness, the kind that makes a man reconsider where he steps and how loudly he speaks. The land itself had become the lesson. Those who lingered long enough noticed patterns that could not be written down. The fog never gathered at random. It rose where the river bent sharply, where currents slowed and memories collected. The birds avoided certain branches but nested heavily in others, as if guided by an invisible hand. The trees nearest the water bore scars in their bark, marks not from tools or lightning, but from something pressed against them repeatedly, patiently, as though the forest had once leaned hard into itself during moments of judgment. Occasionally, a body of water upstream would darken for a single night, mirroring the Blackwater's hue. Those who camped nearby described dreams of standing ankle-deep in water that felt heavier than it should, water that resisted movement not through force, but insistence. They dreamed of voices that did not speak in sentences, but in certainty. Many awoke before dawn and broke camp without discussion, compelled to leave as though an agreement had been silently reached. The elders in nearby settlements began teaching their children differently. They no longer spoke of the forest as something to be conquered, nor the river as something to be crossed without consequence. Instead, they taught listening, how to pause before entering tree cover, how to watch the water before stepping into it, how to recognize when the land itself was saying no. The caboclo d'agua, they explained, was not a creature to be found, but a presence to be acknowledged. If you searched for it, you had already misunderstood. There were still those who sought proof, scholars with notebooks, men with measuring tools and theories. They came rarely, and they left quietly. Their writings spoke in careful language about environmental anomalies, about unusual acoustics and hydrology. None could explain why their compasses failed only at certain hours, or why their notes grew damp even when kept dry. None of them stayed long enough to try. Something in the forest discouraged persistence without confrontation. As time stretched onward, the boundary between story and landscape dissolved entirely. The caboclo d'agua was no longer confined to a shape or a moment. It lived in the way the river reflected faces back differently, depending on who leaned over it. It lived in the way footsteps faded faster than expected in the mud. It lived in the quiet understanding shared between strangers who met near the forest edge and instinctively lowered their voices. On rare occasions, storms gathered above the Blackwater without breaking. Clouds swirled, thunder rolled distantly, and rain threatened without falling. During those hours, the river grew restless, its surface rippling in conflicting directions as if currents argued beneath it. Those who witnessed such moments spoke of a tension in the air, a sense that balance was being tested somewhere beyond sight. By morning, the sky would clear and the forest would remain unchanged, as though a decision had been made and upheld. There were no monuments to Elijah Crow, no marker where he last sat by the river. The forest had no use for such things. Memory was carried differently there, through pattern, through consequence, through restraint. Elijah's legacy was not a story told loudly, but a habit practiced quietly. The habit of listening, the habit of stepping back, the habit of knowing when enough had been taken. Even now, when the world grows louder and the reach of roads and rails stretches farther each year, there remain places like the old Blackwater crossing, places that endure because they are not challenged. In those places, the caboclo d'agua remains, not waiting to punish, but waiting to be remembered. Waiting for the moment when forgetfulness grows bold enough to require correction. The river continues its slow passage, carrying reflections instead of bodies, whispers instead of screams. The forest stands, patient and unyielding, roots deep in soil that has learned the weight of time. And somewhere between water and wood, the father of the forest watches, not with anger, not with mercy, but with the quiet authority of something that has always been there and always will be. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when the land itself seemed to relax, as if satisfied that its warning had finally been understood. During those times, the forest lightened just enough for sunbeams to pierce the canopy in narrow columns, illuminating drifting motes of dust and pollen like suspended stars. The river's surface softened, losing its mirror-dark sheen and reflecting the sky in muted colors. Those who passed through during such hours felt an unfamiliar calm, the kind that settles deep in the chest and encourages silence without fear. It was not forgiveness. It was equilibrium. Yet equilibrium, like water, required constant attention. Every generation tested it in small ways. A careless campfire left too close to roots, a line of traps set where no traps had been before. Each mistake drew a response proportionate and precise. The forest did not burn, the river did not rage. Instead, paths vanished overnight, tools were misplaced beyond recovery. Sleep became restless, filled with dreams of water rising just to the edge of the mouth, never higher, never lower. The lesson was always the same. Delivered without cruelty, but without compromise. Those who learned to live near the Blackwater spoke of time behaving differently there. Days felt longer, nights deeper. Sounds traveled oddly, carrying farther than they should, or disappearing entirely. Some claimed they aged more slowly while staying near the forest, as though the land resisted haste in all its forms. Others felt the opposite. That time pressed heavier, urging them to leave before they grew too comfortable. Both experiences were true, depending on intent. The caboclo d'agua did not govern time, but it understood how it bent around memory. Occasionally, storms would approach from the west, rolling in with dark clouds and distant thunder, only to split around the forest at the last moment. Rain fell hard on the plains beyond, while the trees stood nearly dry, mist clinging to leaves instead of droplets. Witnesses described the sensation as standing inside a held breath. When the storm passed, the forest exhaled slowly, branches creaking, the river smoothing itself as if nothing had threatened it at all. Stories of the father of the forest travelled farther than the place itself ever had. They reached towns that had never seen the Blackwater, carried by men who struggled to explain why they felt compelled to warn others. In those retellings, the Caboclo d'Agua was sometimes described as a giant, sometimes as a shadow, sometimes as a man-shaped reflection moving against the current. The details shifted, but the meaning remained intact. The land is not silent. It speaks in consequences. In quiet moments, those who truly listened could sense the presence without seeing it, a weight in the air near water, a subtle pull of attention toward the forest edge. It was not an invitation to approach, but an acknowledgement of coexistence. The Caboclo d'Agua no longer needed to manifest fully. The balance had become self-sustaining, carried forward by habit, by caution, by respect taught without ceremony. Long after maps forgot the crossing, and roads curved away from the trees, the river continued to mark the boundary between what could be taken and what must be left alone. Fishermen downstream noticed their catches dwindled when greed overtook patience, returning only when restraint returned. Loggers who ignored the old stories found their work plagued by accidents that stopped just short of tragedy, as if something intervened not to destroy but to correct. And in the deepest part of the forest, where roots twisted into the riverbank and water slid silently between them, the Caboclo d'Agua remained inseparable from the land itself, not a figure standing watch, but a presence woven through bark, current, and stone. A memory that did not fade because it was never spoken aloud too often. Those who walked away from the Blackwater carried something with them, a subtle change in how they moved through the world. They stepped lighter. They listened longer. They learned to recognize the difference between silence and being silenced. The forest had taught them, gently and firmly, that survival was not conquest, but cooperation. And so the story endured, not as a warning shouted into the dark, but as a truth whispered just loud enough for those willing to hear it. In places where water slows and trees lean close, the father of the forest still waits, not for fear, not for worship, but for remembrance strong enough to keep the balance unbroken. With passing decades, the Blackwater became less a destination and more a margin, an edge of awareness where the world felt thinner. Those who skirted the forest at a respectful distance noticed how their own thoughts softened there, how urgency dulled and listening took its place. It was as if the land insisted on a slower measure, refusing to be hurried by men who arrived with plans already formed. In that slowing, some felt unease, others felt relief. Both reactions were welcomed by the forest, which had no preference beyond attention. There were nights when the river reflected not the moon, but the canopy above it, a black lattice of branches woven into the water's skin. On those nights, people camped downstream claimed they heard the sound of footsteps crossing water without splashing, followed by a pause, long enough to feel deliberate, before the current resumed its quiet movement. No figures were seen, no threats made. The message was restraint. Even the unseen crossing was measured. Old trails continued to fade, but new ones never truly formed. Paths that appeared one week would be gone the next, reclaimed by ferns and roots that rose with a speed that defied explanation. Survey stakes vanished, painted marks washed away. The forest seemed to prefer memory to markers, teaching those who entered to rely on awareness rather than signs. The Caboclo d'Agua had become the land's way of enforcing that lesson without constant display. In settlements far from Blackwater, children grew up hearing fragments of the story. Not the whole of it, never the whole, but enough to seed caution. A grandmother would warn against taking from streams without offering thanks. A father would teach his son to step back when the woods went quiet. None of them needed to name the father of the forest directly. The habit was the inheritance, not the name. There were rare times when someone claimed to see the Caboclo d'Agua clearly again, always at the edge of vision, always near water at dusk. Descriptions remained consistent despite distance and time. The height, the dark, living texture of its form, the soft green glow of eyes that held neither cruelty nor kindness. Witnesses spoke afterward with a subdued calm, as if the encounter had rearranged something inside them, putting weight back where it belonged. As industry expanded elsewhere, the contrast grew sharper. Rivers choked and forests fell in places that had forgotten to listen. Those lands responded with floods, fires, and failures that demanded attention through loss. Blackwater did not need such extremes. Its warning had already been heard. Its balance, once broken, had been restored through memory rather than catastrophe. The Caboclo d'Agua stood as proof that correction could be quiet if it came early enough. Even scholars who returned years later, older, more cautious, wrote differently after time near the river. Their language softened. Certainty gave way to observation. They spoke of systems rather than dominance, of coexistence rather than control. None could explain exactly why their conclusions shifted. All agreed that something about the place resisted simplification. When winter settled, the forest did not sleep so much as hold itself still. Snow fell lightly beneath the canopy, melting where the ground remained warm with unseen movement. The river steamed faintly in the cold air, carrying the scent of damp earth and old wood. In those moments, the presence of the Father felt closest, not looming, but steady, like a pillar beneath the surface of things. Those who stood quietly at the river's edge during winter nights sometimes felt a subtle pressure at their backs, as though urged to step away, not out of threat, but out of respect for a boundary made firmer by season. They obeyed without argument, leaving the river to its work and the forest to its silence. And so the Blackwater endured, not untouched, but understood. The Caboclo d'Agua did not fade into legend because it did not rely on belief. It relied on behavior. As long as men remembered to listen, to take less than they could, to recognize when a place asked to be left alone, the Father of the forest would remain what it had always been, not an enemy of mankind, but a mirror held up to it. There is a point in every long-lived place where memory becomes thicker than soil. Blackwater reached that point quietly. It did not announce itself with disaster or spectacle. It simply settled into permanence, the way deep water settles after being disturbed. Those who came near it late in the century found that even their thoughts slowed, as if the land demanded a different pace of mind. Plans felt heavier there. Words felt unnecessary. Listening became instinct rather than effort. Stories of the Caboclo d'Agua were no longer told as warnings alone, but as explanations for why certain things endured while others failed. Parents spoke of the forest when teaching children patience. Elders used the river as an example when explaining restraint. The Father of the forest had become woven into everyday understanding, not as a creature to fear, but as a presence that shaped behavior through consequence rather than command. On long summer evenings, travelers sometimes camped far enough downstream to feel safe, yet close enough to sense the weight of the place. They would sit by their fires and notice how sound behaved differently, the crackle of wood sharper, the murmur of water deeper. More than one traveler reported the unsettling feeling that the darkness beyond the firelight was not empty, but occupied, not hostile, simply aware. Those travelers tended to leave early the next morning, folding their camps carefully, extinguishing embers with deliberate care, as though cleanliness itself were a form of respect. As decades turned and the frontier era faded into history, the Blackwater remained unchanged by progress. Rails never reached it, roads never cut through it. It existed in the margins, where maps grew vague and language failed to fully capture experience. Hunters spoke of game that appeared when needed and vanished when pursued too aggressively. Fishermen learned that the river yielded more to those who waited than to those who cast repeatedly. The land had become a teacher, and the Caboclo d'Agua its unseen voice. Occasionally, someone would ask if the father of the forest still appeared. Those who truly knew never answered directly. Appearance was not the measure of presence. The river's restraint, the forest's patience, the subtle redirection of those who forgot themselves, these were the signs that mattered. The caboclo d'agua no longer needed to step from water or shadow. Its work was being done through habit, through memory passed carefully from one generation to the next. There were moments, however, when the old presence made itself faintly visible again, always at thresholds, always when balance wavered. A figure reflected where no reflection should be, a ripple moving against the current, a sudden stillness that pressed against the ears until a person felt compelled to step back. Those moments were brief, unmistakable, and never repeated for the same witness. The father corrected gently now, confident in the strength of the lesson already learned. Toward the end of the century, a fire broke out miles away, driven by reckless clearing and dry winds. Smoke darkened the sky, and for a time it seemed the destruction would reach the forest's edge. But the fire slowed as it approached Blackwater, its advance stalling inexplicably as moisture gathered in the air and the wind shifted direction. By morning, the flames had turned aside, leaving the forest untouched. Those who saw it said nothing for a long time afterward. Some truths did not need interpretation. When the last living witnesses of the old village passed on, Blackwater did not vanish with them. It remained as a place people felt before they saw. Even now, those who wander too close speak of a sudden urge to lower their voices, to tread lightly, to acknowledge something vast and patient sharing the space with them. No sign marks the boundary, no warning stands posted. The land itself carries the message. The caboclo d'agua endures not because it is remembered perfectly, but because it is remembered enough to keep hands from taking too much, enough to make feet pause at the water's edge. Enough to remind those who listen that the forest and the river are not silent simply because they do not speak in human words. The father of the forest does not rule, it does not pursue, it does not demand belief. It waits. It waits in the slowing of footsteps, in the quieting of voices, in the moment a man chooses to turn back instead of pressing forward. The river continues its ancient course, carrying reflection instead of ruin. The forest stands, roots deep in soil that has learned patience, and between them, unseen yet undeniable, the caboclo d'agua remains, guardian of balance, keeper of memory, and reminder that the oldest power in the world is not force, but restraint. And so the story ends not with silence, but with listening, because the forest is still there, the river is still flowing, and the Father of the waters is still watching.